In 1969, two sovereign nations deployed their militaries, bombed each other's territories, and fought a deadly interstate war, supposedly because of a soccer match. But a football game does not mobilize armies on its own. Behind the famous headlines, this conflict was driven by decades of severe land hoarding, mass migration, and a toxic wave of nationalism. Looking at this demographic map of Central America in the 1960s, the economic imbalance is stark. El Salvador, here in red, is small and tightly packed, with a tiny elite controlling almost all the profitable farmland. Right next door, Honduras is a much larger territory, with vast stretches of sparsely populated available land. With no space to farm at home, hundreds of thousands of rural Salvadorans simply crossed the border. They settled in Honduran territory, rented plots, and built farming communities. For years, this movement acted as a vital pressure valve for El Salvador's crowded economy. But inside Honduras, it slowly created a fierce, localized competition for resources between the newly arrived migrants and native Honduran peasants. By the late 1960s, roughly 300,000 Salvadorans were living and working in Honduras. Local Honduran farmers, many of whom also lacked secure land titles, began to view these migrants as direct threats to their own livelihoods. Facing mounting pressure and unrest from its own rural citizens, the Honduran government rolled out a sweeping national land reform policy aimed at redistributing property. This map shows how that policy played out on the ground. Salvadoran migrants were specifically targeted. Families who had lived there for years were stripped of their leases, forced off their farms, and marched back toward the Salvadoran border. Politicians and newspapers in both capital cities immediately seized on the crisis. Honduran media painted the migrants as an invading force, while Salvadoran radio broadcast stories of abuse and violence, stoking intense public outrage. Rather than fixing the underlying poverty in their respective countries, political leaders found it easier to blame outsiders. Long before the first whistle of any soccer match, these governments had armed a geopolitical bomb. Against this backdrop of deportations and furious headlines, the two countries drew each other in the qualifying rounds for the 1970 FIFA World Cup. Honduras won the first match in Tegucigalpa, El Salvador took the second in San Salvador, and a playoff in Mexico City decided the series. But the score barely mattered. Riots spilled out of the stadiums, with crowds clashing in the streets while the nationalist press cheered them on. The sporting events gave the two governments a highly visible pretext to escalate. El Salvador formally accused Honduras of state-sponsored terror against its migrants, while Honduras claimed El Salvador was threatening its sovereignty. Within days, diplomatic ties collapsed. Embassies shut their doors, ambassadors were recalled, and both militaries mobilized heavily along the shared border. The matches did not invent the hostility between the two neighbors. They provided the exact nationalist symbol required to push public anger into a formal state confrontation. On July 14, 1969, El Salvador initiated a coordinated military offensive. They crossed the border by land and launched targeted air attacks against Honduran positions. This tactical map illustrates the invasion. Salvadoran ground troops advanced deep into Honduran territory along major roadways. In response, Honduran forces mounted heavy resistance blockades and deployed their air force for retaliatory bombing runs on Salvadoran infrastructure. The scale of the violence terrified neighboring countries, who feared the conflict would ignite the entire Central American region. The Organization of American States called an emergency session to force a halt to the fighting. Facing intense diplomatic threats and the prospect of severe economic sanctions, El Salvador agreed to withdraw its troops. A ceasefire took effect after roughly 100 hours of active combat. 4 days. That is how quickly a localized dispute over farming leases escalated into a war involving infantry, air raids, and thousands of casualties. The shooting stopped, but the damage was permanent. Trade routes between the two nations were blocked for over a decade, and regional cooperation collapsed. If we look back at the map of El Salvador, the structural problem only grew worse. 130,000 displaced Salvadorans flooded back into a country that had no land to give them, accelerating massive internal pressures that would eventually erupt into civil war. Today, we call this the Football War. It is a catchy title that makes the event sound almost absurd, masking a grim story of total institutional failure. The games played in 1969 were not the cause of the violence. they were just a spark landing on decades of dry geopolitical tinder. When governments ignore extreme inequality and weaponize xenophobia to maintain their own power, the resulting tension will eventually find an outlet, and when it does, even a simple game can trigger a catastrophe.